Hello out there. I'm Poetic Heretic, and tonight we will be looking at the astrology of January 2019. So as always, if you're watching when this is not live, feel free to fast forward until 5 minutes in, where we will officially begin. In the meantime, I will set up the stream. Hello, Connor. Welcome. You're the first viewer, and it does appear. How do we look in sound, though? Okay, good. Why did I take so long? A myriad of reasons. All kinds of things delayed me. Probably the biggest issue is that I needed a lot more sleep. I think I had been pushing my body too hard in recent times, and so I had to sleep in today, basically, and then I had to make all kinds of preparations before I could stream, basically. But it's just the way things work around here. My body has very stubborn limitations, shall we say, and I just have to make do with them, do the best I can with them. Wait, why did I accidentally close that? Live stream is sponsored by me, live from this hotel hot tub. Ooh, very cool, Ryan. A hotel hot tub. Sounds luxurious. Okay, let's send this to Twitter. Yeah, it feels weird going live this late, but, you know, I'm doing the best I can. Gotta do the best I can do. All right, what should I say? I'm live analyzing the astrology of January 2019. Come watch. As luxurious as a construction job can be. Sounds like something I would say. All right, so we will officially begin in just over 2 minutes. Yeah, this should be a fun stream. There's a lot of stuff, we'll just say that, happening in January that I'm already aware of. And there's also some interesting stuff coming up throughout the rest of the year, some things that are fairly obvious I'll be able to comment on. Quick dip in the pool, BRB. All right, have fun, Ryan. I am in crisis, can you help? I'm not sure. Connor, what kind of help do you need? What is the nature of your crisis? I mean, I'll have to begin my forecast in just over a minute, but until then, I could try to communicate something to you briefly. My family might be going back to Ireland. What is the challenge relating to that? But I don't know if they are. Why would that be a bad thing? All right, we are 40 seconds away from beginning. So people in England who I'm friends with, lad. I see. There is much that could be said about a situation like that, and as much as I want to address that, I guess this isn't really the time or place. The best I could do is say that we could try to address it after we go over the material today. But in the meantime, all I can say is when facing any kind of challenge in life, the best thing that you can do, generally speaking, is to sort of surrender to it, to allow yourself to feel it, allow yourself to feel what you feel. And then when you allow things, that gives them a chance to change for the better. But we are 5 minutes in, and so we must begin. So as you can see, those watching now and those who watch in the future, this is an astrology forecast for the month of January 2019. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through it day by day, and I'm going to attempt to sort of tell the astrological story of the month and, you know, the energy affecting the entire world and what we can expect generally. And I'll start it off by starting with where we are, and that's going to include yesterday and today, since this is the 2nd of January that I'm filming this at, or recording, or whatever, broadcasting where I'm at in the world, 9:42 p.m. Eastern time. And then once I've established where we are, we will go from there. And again, I'll tell the story kind of day by day. And since this is the beginning of the year, the first month of the year, January 2019, once we've gone through the whole month, I will make some comments about some astrological patterns coming up in the rest of the year, because there's some very important stuff coming up. And it's not that I'm going to be able to give like a full, proper, like year ahead astrological forecast. It's just that there are some very some very obvious things that are obvious to me, at least, that are going to be happening astrologically throughout the course of 2019 that it would be very helpful to address in the stream. So, you know, it's not like I have some big thing put together. That this is no effort on my part. This is just stuff that, to me, because I look at this stuff literally every single day of my life, is obvious that we will look at coming up in the next year. So, without further ado, let us begin. Also, you guys might have to remind me at times if the video feed gets blurry, because it is evening, and while I have the astrological data up in another window, I have to block out the video feed on my end. So if it gets blurry, I won't be able to see, but I'll try to check that from time to time. I can still see the chat though, but I'll only be looking at it, I guess, from time to time, so I can stay focused, basically. All right, let's see here. I don't wish to impose, but if after the material you could do a thought on the situation, I'd be very grateful. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it might be a little while because it is a whole month we're going over this time, but if you're able to stick around, then yes, absolutely. We could do a tarot reading to help you out in your situation. All right, so again, I'm going to start with where we are. And I guess I'm going to mainly focus on today, although we'll talk a little bit about January 1st as well. And then we'll go from there. Okay, so basically, let me see. Let me just make a brief comment about January 1st. So we came into the year with Mars just having entered Aries. That's going to be one of the most important things for that day, and also, I guess, the month moving forward. So Mars was in Pisces for a while, I think about, I don't know, 6 weeks or so, if I'm not mistaken, and where it was like the spiritual warrior and stuff like that. And so that sort of thing was getting emphasized in humanity as a whole. But now Mars has moved into its home sign of Aries, and that actually happened just a couple of hours before midnight, January 1st, Eastern time at least. And so now with Mars in its home sign of Aries, we can expect the energy worldwide to be much more impulsive, much more go-getter. You know, again, it's Mars' home sign. You know, Mars is almost, I don't know, if I imagined Mars as a character at this time, he would probably be like, well, finally I'm home and I can go get the shit I've been trying to go get for a long time now. And so that kind of energy is being infused, or is, infusing itself into the collective at this time. And Mars will be there for quite some time. Definitely all of this month. Looks like Mars will move into Taurus sometime in February. So I just wanted to say that about January 1st, as well as, of course, the moon coming into the year was in Scorpio. It aligned with Venus. That is now past, however. And let's see if there's anything else. Basically that brings us right into right now, January 2nd, 2019, where the moon is in Sagittarius. It's 3 degrees away from aligning with Jupiter at this time, which we'll talk about soon enough. But probably the biggest event that we just had, and we just had this late last night at 12:49 a.m. Eastern time, is the Sun-Saturn conjunction in Capricorn. And so this happens about once a year, because the sun goes around once a year and Saturn doesn't move very fast, but I guess a little less than once a year. But this is the first time in nearly 30 years that the sun has aligned with Saturn in the sign of Capricorn. It's the first time that the sun has been conjunct Saturn in Capricorn. How do I know this? Because I was born the last time the sun was aligned with Saturn in Capricorn. So yeah, it's been nearly, well, I guess technically nearly 29 years since that last happened. And when we see the sun aligning with Saturn, Saturn is, you get what you deserve: karma, discipline, rules, structure, order, regulations, things of this nature. Saturn is the reality. And so basically speaking, we're all getting a very strong dose of reality at this time in some way, shape, or form. We're hitting a wall in many cases. It can manifest that way as well. We're having to contend with limitation. Limitation is a huge aspect of this Saturnian energy. And it's interesting to note also, and I'm not going to get deep into this, but the sun and Saturn are, for many reasons, like opposite energies in many ways. Like if you were to put this into like religious terms, like the sun would be God and Saturn would be Satan. And so here we're seeing them line up and, well, I wouldn't exactly say work together, because that's not really what a conjunction is, but we're seeing their energy trying to get into the same spot. We're seeing a fusion of that energy. And so that's a very big thing happening right now, basically speaking, is this strong dose of reality and having to contend with limitation. So one of the most important things that we're dealing with right now. On the other hand, we have, as I mentioned, the moon in Sagittarius, and only 3 degrees, really a little less than 3 degrees away from aligning with Jupiter in Sagittarius, and that's Jupiter's home sign. And so let me think of how I want to describe this. Well, where Saturn is contraction, Jupiter is expansion. Where Saturn is pessimism, Jupiter is optimism. Where Saturn is limitation, Jupiter is the idea of not being limited at all, or at least the belief in not being limited. And so it's funny because even though we have that Sun-Saturn conjunction thing going on, facing the limitations and whatnot right now, we also, and maybe it's not quite as powerful, but it's still fairly powerful, have this sense of expansion and hope that is building at this time. This part of it, though, the hopeful part of it, is more ephemeral, more temporary, because it's really only going to last for as long as the moon crosses over Jupiter, and then somewhat while the moon is still in Sagittarius. But nevertheless, we have, this sense of hope and idealism that's sort of clashing with reality that's being emphasized by Saturn at this time. And that moon aligning with Jupiter perfects at, let me see, 3:23 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So adjust your time zone calculations accordingly. So that is more or less when the energy of that will peak, the idealism, the hope, and all that. Now, so those are some of the major things going on right now, but let me describe the rest of the energy and really establish the picture of, again, where we are right now. So the sun, of course, as I mentioned, is in Capricorn, along with Saturn, the Sun-Saturn conjunction, so we've got that very serious vibe going on right now. Mercury is at 2658 of Sagittarius, so finishing up its transit through Sagittarius, so our thoughts are still very Sagittarian-like, hopeful, idealistic, inspired, that sort of thing. Venus is at 2535 of Scorpio, so almost done with her transit through Scorpio, making our relationships and interactions with other people very deep, intense, passionate, all or nothing, that sort of thing. Mars, as I mentioned earlier, is now in Aries. It's currently at 121 of Aries. So I'm not going to go back over all of that, but as I mentioned, we have the aggression, the impulsiveness, the go-getter energy, all of that going on. Mars is right at home in Aries. It's its home sign, as is Scorpio. Mars has two homes. And so let's just go right along here. Jupiter, as I mentioned, in Sagittarius, that's a more long-term aspect. That's where Jupiter will be until December of this year, which is going to continually clash with Saturn in Capricorn, kind of like I mentioned earlier, for the rest of this year. Though Saturn will be in Capricorn until 2020, so even longer. But it's funny, right now, with the moon about to align with Jupiter in Sagittarius and the sun having just aligned with Saturn in Capricorn, we're almost getting like a microcosm example of the entire rest of the year, which is funny because we're just starting the year. It's like we're getting a dose of things to come right now, basically speaking. So let's see what else we have here. Saturn in Capricorn, we talked about enough, the reality and all that, the seriousness of things. Uranus is in Aries. It's preparing to go direct in, where the hell is it? Just under 4 days. And Uranus in Aries is basically all about rebellion, or at least that's my interpretation of it. We did have Uranus in Taurus for quite some time in 2018, ever since the month of May and up until I think November, but for much of 2018 regardless, which we'll talk more about at some point. But basically, Uranus going direct in just a few days, we might see some subtle shifts around that which is shocking and unexpected, that which is weird, also mental insights and revelations and stuff like that, sudden flashes of insight. There may be some rumbling, so to speak, in that area in the next few days to a week or two, I would say. But once Uranus enters Taurus in March, once Uranus returns to Taurus in March, that's when we're really going to see a significant shift in the energy in that area. And so I'll probably talk about that more towards the end of the stream when I make my remarks about the upcoming year, because that's going to be one of the most important things. But yeah, we'll leave it at that for now. As always, Neptune is in Pisces, Pluto is in Capricorn. We don't really need to talk about those right now because those aspects are incredibly slow moving. And of course, Chiron is at the very end of Pisces and is now direct and will enter Aries. Do I have it here? No, I do not. Well, just one moment then. Chiron will enter Aries. definitely by March 1st. Let's back up a bit more. By February 18th, Chiron will return to Aries, because it was in Aries for a while, kind of like Uranus was in Taurus for a while, but then the retrogrades changed that. But yes, Chiron, which talks about our wounds and the healing of wounds, Chiron, the wounded healer, is finishing up its transit through Pisces. So, much more emotional, sensitive energy in that area when it comes to the healing of wounds. And then, next month we'll see it move into Aries, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. So let us see what else we have here. Let me fix that blur. Where is the Scorpio at? I imagine you're asking how is Scorpio doing these days? Well, it's hard to say for individual signs, but the only planet that we have in Scorpio is Venus, as I mentioned briefly earlier. And so I would imagine that Scorpios right now are feeling that Venusian desire, I would say. Venus is the planet of love, and so love also likes and dislikes. That which is beautiful and sensuous is most likely being emphasized for Scorpios everywhere at this time. Now, it's also important to point out, though, some of the aspects that we have going on currently to establish this picture of where we are. So, oh boy, there's so much here. What should I go over first? Well, first of all, one of the things that really jumps out at me is, speaking of Venus, this grand water trine going on right now between Venus, Chiron, and the North Node. And it's also got Mars somewhat hooked into it in Aries, and so I'm not sure what you would call that, a grand water fire trine, who knows, but so Venus, the planet of love, is harmonizing with Chiron, the object of the healing of wounds, and they're both harmonizing with the North Node in Cancer. The North Node talking about life purpose and sort of like where we're going and stuff like that. There's a lot that could be said about that, but I'm basically just going to sum it up by saying that when we see a grand water trine like this, the idea is that, first of all, it's water, so that's going to be emotion. So there's a lot of emotional energy active right now. But second of all, when we see a grand water trine, this is something that is like a self-contained circuit, right? And that can be the danger of it, because you get a grand water trine going on, or a grand trine of any kind, and you find basically one area of your life that's working so well in perfect harmony, but it can be easy to get caught up in that area of your life and not pay attention to other areas that need your attention, stuff that's outside of that grand trine, and in this case, a grand water trine. So keep that in mind. Now, I personally have noticed that anytime there's a grand water trine, I tend to get, it tends to manifest negatively for me, funny enough. I tend to get kind of moody, or I tend to get kind of emotionally out of whack. So perhaps that could happen as well, but that might just be the way that I respond to that energy. But yeah, basically we're talking emotional stuff right now. And we'll be in this grand water trine for quite a while, because Venus is still going to connect us to it. Looks like it'll really begin to fade kind of around January 9th, 10th, 11th. But yeah, like around that time, I guess, more or less, is when it's really going to be fading. In fact, we haven't really reached the most intense part of it yet. It's a little hard to say when that will be, but if I look at what's in front of me, I would say probably roughly January 4th will be the peak, the height of this grand water trine. So while we have that going on, though, we also have Mercury getting ready to perfectly trine Uranus. And so something like that, we're talking getting lots of flashes of insight, lots of mental activity, all kinds of stuff going on in that area. The mind working a lot and having sudden thoughts that you aren't expecting. And not necessarily negative thoughts, maybe even not that likely to be negative thoughts, but just thoughts, lots of mental activity, and new insights, new realizations, a lot more communication, at least possible, that sort of thing. Let's see, what else? The moon, as I mentioned earlier, being quite close to perfectly aligning with Jupiter, the moon and Jupiter are moving closer and closer to a perfect square with Neptune. Now, when we're talking, how should I say this? I feel like there's so much that could be said about this. When we're talking the moon square Neptune and also Jupiter square Neptune, we're most likely going to be looking at the negative effects of Neptune. We're most likely going to be looking at the energy of confusion and misinformation and subjectivity, or way too much subjectivity, looking at intoxication, Neptune rules drugs and alcohol and stuff like that. Both the moon and Neptune are reflective objects, so that's interesting to consider. And then Jupiter's all about expansion, but so is Neptune. But Jupiter's about the expansion up to the limits of Saturn. Neptune, being outside of Saturn's orbit, can expand and expand and expand without limit. And so how does all this manifest when we put it together? Well, basically, there's a risk of being overly optimistic, especially in the next, 12 hours or so, I would say, or the next, 9 hours or so. A risk of being overly optimistic to the point of being delusional. But that's mainly just with the moon's involvement. With Jupiter's involvement, squaring Neptune, oh boy, how should I even describe this? Jupiter square Neptune is just the idea of too much, and too much fantasy realms, and being unable to tell what's real, and too much confusion, or even possibly too much creativity, Neptune, to the point that it leaves us confused. Negative side of Neptune, with Jupiter being that which is the too much, that which magnifies. So I can see people are leaving because this stuff is hard to describe, but that's okay. Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to put this into as astrologically accurate terms as possible. So if I'm taking a bit to explain it, that's why. So let's see what else we have. You're still here? Thank you, Connor. Thank you, sir. All right, what other aspects do we have right now? Well, on a more positive note, that Sun-Saturn conjunction I mentioned earlier is within a couple of degrees of a supportive sextile to Neptune. And so here we're talking harmonious energy. And so it's funny because at the same time that we have this risk of being overly optimistic to the point of being delusional, there's also this support building sort of in the background between the Sun and Saturn with Neptune, saying, oh, well, actually, maybe we can make the dream real. Maybe we can focus our imagination or intuition properly, or focus these imagined things into reality. Maybe we won't be able to do it today or tomorrow, but closer and closer maybe we can. And really what we're looking at here, and I guess I'll get into the majority of this as we get to that part, but the sun's going to sextile Neptune in just less than 2 days. And so that's going to be much more like the ego working harmoniously with Neptune, the planet of dreams and imagination. And so that's going to be one part of it. Okay. So in about 2 days, being able to focus our intuition and stuff like that. But Saturn won't perfectly sextile Neptune for a little while just yet. And I don't have that right in front of me, but I believe it happens by the end of the month. Wait, let me just see. Yes, it does. Looks like pretty much the very end of the month. That, at the very end of the month, will be when we're much more likely to be able to make the dream real. So it's almost like we're getting a hint of it now, and like in the next couple of days, being able to focus on our dreams or that which we imagine, our ideals and stuff like that. But it won't actually be till the end of the month that we can make those dreams a reality, basically speaking. So there's that aspect of it. Let's see what else. Is there anything else right now before we continue day by day? Well, as I mentioned earlier, like with Mars being at the first degrees of Aries and Chiron being at the last degrees of Pisces, well, they were recently conjunct. And so if you noticed any extra aggression in the area of life regarding the healing of wounds and stuff like that, whether that manifested positively or negatively for you, you can know that now that is basically fading because Mars is getting significantly ahead of Chiron, and that's just, what we're going to continue to see, basically. So, that aspect of things is fading away. But other than that, there's not really a whole lot more to say about establishing where we are. So from here, I think hopefully those watching and listening have gotten a fairly clear picture of where we are at right now, energetically. From here, we're going to go through the rest of the month, day by day, and talk about how this story unfolds, how this energy evolves bit by bit as we go throughout the month. So let's see. Stream's still looking good. Connor, you feel like you understand? I assume by saying yeah, so that's good. Glad to hear it. And here we go. So moving into tomorrow, January 3rd, the moon is still in Sagittarius. Now, halfway through the day, Eastern time, 12 p.m. It's at 1642 of Sagittarius. It will, of course, as I mentioned earlier, square Neptune, so there's a bit of a risk for a sort of overinflated sense of optimism for the world at large. But other than that, moon in Sagittarius, generally we're feeling hopeful. We're feeling like we can do it. We're feeling optimistic. So that would be the main thing for that day. And moving on to January 4th, let us just see here. Well, on January 4th, soon after 12 p.m. Eastern time, and just before 1 p.m. Eastern time, the moon will align with Mercury at the very end of Sagittarius, at 29 of Sagittarius. And so that's going to have us being focused much more like mentally that day, much more mental activity going on that day. And since it's happening in Sagittarius, we're going to be looking at exaggerated mental activity that day, even more communication. Again, Sagittarius is that Jupiterian energy of more and more and more. And so all kinds of communication may be exaggerated that day, or simply there could be a lot of it. We'll be in the mood to communicate. Our mood is the moon. The moon is our mood. We'll be in the mood to communicate and or to think a lot that day. But that will shift somewhat around, let's see here, just after 2 p.m. when the moon then enters Capricorn. So just after 2 p.m. Eastern Time, January 4th, the moon will move into Capricorn, and the rest of the day will be much more serious, much more, it's time to look at the reality, face the reality, and also much more stable. It's also interesting to note, however, that while the moon aligns with Mercury that day, and a little bit before and a little bit after, it will be squaring Chiron. And so some of our thoughts, communications that day may be like, oh boy, how do I put this accurately? There will likely be a part of us that wants to engage in all that mental activity. There will be another part of us that needs some healing of wounds, and those two parts of us are not going to want to work together that day, or they're at the very least more predisposed to being in conflict. And so the challenge there that day is, if you have unhealed stuff, as the majority of the human race does, use your mind to try to heal some of that, So that's the message and the challenge for that day. Let's see, what else? The moon will also square Mars that day, a little bit later on. We're talking around 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So moon square Mars, there's the risk for a little too much aggression, too much assertion, the risk of anger and stuff like that. So not too great of a risk, but it's certainly there. So something to keep in mind for that day as well. Let's see, anything else? As this is happening, Venus is getting closer and closer to her perfect trine with Chiron. And so, the part of us that is all about love and beauty and that which we like and enjoy, harmonizing with the part of us that deals with the healing of wounds. So that's some good energy sort of building up in the background. All right, now what else? All right, moving on to January 5th. The moon is, of course, still in Capricorn, but now, today, the moon, or this day, January 5th, is lining up with Saturn. So there's going to be an emphasis on, reality and facts and everything, especially because it's in Capricorn. So limitations. And then we have it lining up with the sun, thus therefore a new moon in Capricorn, marking the beginning of a new cycle that will last for the next month, or month, maybe I should say. That is going to be, rooted in this reality-based, factual, it is what it is, Capricornian energy. So new moon in Capricorn on January 5th, a whole new cycle begins. And what we also have that day is a solar eclipse. And that's the thing that is the most intense thing of all here that we've gone over thus far, basically. Solar eclipse in Capricorn, we're talking an event that, how do I even put this? It's almost like anything can happen, but it's not necessarily that anything can happen right when the eclipse happens. The eclipses are weird in astrology in that, we could see that which they are about up to 6 months before them, and or up to 6 months after them. So that's, what we have to keep in mind. But regardless, that's adding to the energy of that day, that eclipse happening on that day, January 5th at 8:41 p.m. Eastern Time. So I think for some of my UK viewers, it's going to be on very early on January 6th, if I'm not mistaken. But eclipses in astrology, to the best of my knowledge, are events where it's like reality itself becomes much more malleable, flexible, where like the the veil between dimensions is thin, and where like anything can happen basically. But it's, again, it's not necessarily anything can happen that very day, but anything can happen around that eclipse. So 6 months before, or up to 6 months before, and up to 6 months after. But the fact that it's happening on January 5th, that it could also be that that day is when we see some very interesting and highly unusual activity. So be on the lookout for that. Other than that, let me see if there's anything else that day while I sip my tea. Well, the trine with Venus and Chiron does perfect that day, so I'll mention that briefly. So, and that happens at 1 p.m., exactly 1 p.m. Eastern Time, January 5th. So that day may also be about, again, Venus, what we love and what we enjoy, Chiron, healing of wounds, and a trine, that's a harmonious aspect, making it very easy for us to enjoy this sort of healing of wounds, deep psychological insights, especially when they're both in water signs, Venus and deep, dark, passionate, Scorpio, all about the unconscious realm, Chiron and psychic, sensitive, Pisces, all about intuition and emotion, stuff like that. So that's some very, maybe some of it's going to be like a little bit scary-ish or shadowy or whatever, but generally speaking, I would interpret that as some likely to be very delicious energy, if you can at least not be afraid of it. However, some people are afraid of doing anything when it comes to the healing of wounds, which is highly detrimental and leads to problems in many areas. And I see we're blurry. Let's fix that real quick. So moving on to January 6th. Early that day, the moon will line up with Pluto in Capricorn, and so we're going to be talking about the deep unconscious realms being emphasized again, power being emphasized. So, look out for stuff like that day. We're also having Uranus going direct that day at 3:27 p.m. Eastern Time. So when an outer planet goes direct, I don't know if it's always that significant right then and there because they are moving so slowly. But basically, there will be at least a subtle shift in the energy that day, January 6th, in the area of life having to do with that which is unexpected, that which is sudden and shocking, that which is weird and different, that which is genius, insightful, things of that nature. A subtle shift in the background on January 6th when it comes to that Uranian energy. And we'll really start feeling the effects of that much more, I think, in the weeks and months ahead. All right, anything else here? Let's see. The moon will sextile Venus very late that night. I'm trying to find out when exactly. Around 1:30 a.m. or so Eastern Time, January 7th, the moon will sextile Venus, so a little bit of deliciousness getting inserted into the mix, but let's not focus too much upon that right now. Try to stick with the stuff that's more prevalent, more noticeable. As for January 7th in general, the moon has moved into Aquarius that day, and so that's leading to an energy of detachment and, oh boy, being more intellectual about things, seeing the entirety of things in a much more logical, detached manner. The moon after sextiling Venus, will sextile Mars. That's going to be more in the late morning hours, again, Eastern time. So adding an element of aggression to the mix, but generally speaking, a much more like detached sort of intellectual approach kind of day. Not an emotional kind of day, much more in the mind. And then don't want to miss anything. Well, as we're going here, Mercury, by 12 p.m. Eastern Time, January 7th, Mercury is at 351 of Capricorn, about to square Mars at 427 of Aries. And so there might be this energy building up of like conflicts and fighting, because Mercury is our mind, our thoughts, our communication, and it's a square, a hard aspect. And Mars, if we're going to talk about the negative side of Mars or the dark side of Mars, it's always going to be fighting and anger and stuff like that. Unhealthy aggression, one could say. So there may be a risk of that day, but again, our saving grace is that the moon is in Aquarius, and that's allowing us to view things much more easily in a detached mental or intellectual perspective. And then as we move to January 8th, the moon is still in Aquarius, and the Mercury square Mars is now past its point of perfecting, so it perfects earlier that day. It looks like, let me just double check that. Yes, earlier that day at 5:04 a.m. And so we're still in that detached sort of mood, and maybe if there have been any conflicts, they're starting to simmer away. But a very significant development indeed is that, and actually I missed this from the day before because it perfected the day before, is that Venus enters Sagittarius. That happens exactly at 6:17 a.m. Eastern Time, January 7th. Venus moves from Scorpio to Sagittarius. This will mark a very significant shift in the energy. So whereas Venus and Scorpio had our relationships and stuff like that being all like deep and intense and all or nothing and passionate and the risk of getting like lost in the passion and all of that, now Venus is moving into Sagittarius, where our relationships and likes and dislikes and stuff like that are going to feel much more hopeful and optimistic. It's adding to that energy of Jupiter and Sagittarius that we already have going on. So, think of kind of the area in our lives where we've already been feeling optimistic and idealistic, and January 7th, as Venus enters Sagittarius, just turn that up a notch. We're going to feel even more like, oh yeah, like we can do it and we can succeed and we can whatever, but nevertheless, we've still got Mercury, Saturn, the Sun, and Pluto, 4 planets or objects, whatever, with the Sun, all in Capricorn. Cold, calculating, serious Capricorn. So it's not like it's not like we can escape from reality or anything like that. It's just that there's going to be an added dose, and a pretty strong one, I would say, of optimism starting January 7th with Venus entering Sagittarius. And maybe, yes, like when it comes to relationship issues and stuff like that, this isn't promising that everything will suddenly get instantly better, but generally speaking, people will likely see a shift towards the positive when it comes to relationships of all kinds starting January 7th. Maybe my ex will message me, Connor says. Well, if that is what you desire, Connor, then I hope it happens for you. So let's see, what else? Let me look at January 8th for a moment, and then we will continue. Well, early on January 8th, the moon will sextile Jupiter, and that happens around the hell is it? Just before 5 a.m. Eastern time. And so pretty much that whole day, January 8th, but especially like earlier on in it, that's going to have us feeling even more like enthusiastic and, like we can do it, and idealistic and hopeful and optimistic and all that. And whether or not feeling that way is warranted, I don't know. It's hard to tell because we've got quite the mix of energies here, quite the mix as we have been over. So that's what we've got for January 8th. Then January 9th, let us just see. All right, first of all, we have the moon sextiling Uranus on January 9th, just before 12 p.m. Eastern time. So that's going to lead us to, the sudden insights, the sudden shocking developments, stuff like that may have us in the mood for doing things a little differently, in the mood for a lot of mental activity, perhaps, especially since the moon is in Aquarius still. It's at the very end of Aquarius when it sextiles Uranus, and Aquarius is Uranus' home sign. So we've got all that Aquarian, Uranian, mental, weird, sudden, shocking, unexpected intellectual energy activated significantly on January 9th. But that will shift that day around 3 p.m., just before 3 p.m. Eastern time, when the moon moves into psychic, sensitive, intuitive, gentle Pisces. And things will take on a much more emotional and subjective and spiritual vibe as opposed to the intellectual and detached one that we had for a couple of days. As the moon does this, it squares Venus a couple hours later. So we're talking, some conflicts in the area of like trying to get what we want, trying to get what we like. We might have to wait for what we want that day or that evening, especially perfects just after 8 p.m. Eastern time. So there may be some, frustrations in that area, but that's what we have. Let's see what else. As this is happening, the sun is getting closer and closer to aligning with Pluto. So let's just take a look at January 10th here. All right, so when does the sun perfectly align with Pluto? Do I have that here? It's not till January 11th. So, well, let me try to describe this. On January 10th, we have the sun getting close to aligning with Pluto. By 12 p.m. Eastern time, it's less than a degree away. And so when the sun meets Pluto, we're talking about shining the light of our awareness, the sun, into the deep unconscious realms, Pluto, and into that which has to do with power as well. And a number of other things, but I'd say those would be the most significant. And that energy is building on January 10th. It will not perfect that day, will not peak that day, but it is building intensely on January 10th. So look out for that. Things are going to get intense on January 10th and 11th. I can tell you that right now. While this is happening, the moon continues its transit through Pisces and aligns with Neptune in Pisces later that day. See if I can find that real quick. Just before 8 p.m. Eastern time. And so as the moon lines up with Neptune and Pisces, that's going to activate our intuition, our spirituality, our psychic perceptions, creativity, all the subjective realms, the mystical visions and stuff like that. So January 10th really would be a great day for any kind of creativity. So, if you're planning on doing anything artistic around that time, pick January 10th is my recommendation, especially because as the moon aligns with Neptune and Pisces, both of them are being squared by Jupiter in Sagittarius. Jupiter at 1350 of Sagittarius, and the moon and Neptune around 1420 of Pisces. So very close to being perfect. So it's a square, it's a challenging aspect, but Jupiter just magnifies anything it touches and is usually much more good luck than any kind of bad luck. So again, if you use that energy wisely that day, January 10th, for something creative or that uses your imagination or your intuition or anything like that, and you pick what feels right for you, then you'll be using that energy in a positive way, a way that will work out really well for you. Even as the sun is getting closer and closer to aligning with Pluto and sort of raising the dead and all dark things and stuff like that. Interestingly enough, just as an aside here, for any students of tarot that may be watching, the sun conjunct Pluto reminds me of the Judgment card, card 20 of the Major Arcana, or the Eon card, as it is known in the Crowley Thoth deck, because that card is ruled by the sun and Pluto. And again, this is my interpretation only, but whenever I see that card, the Judgment card, I think, yeah, this is totally the sun meets Pluto. And so if you want a deeper understanding of what part of January 10th and 11th and just kind of thereabouts in the month will be about, study the Judgment card in tarot. Study that card. It will tell you. It will give you that kind of energy again, in my opinion. So what else do we have here? I'm going to turn my heater down real quick. It's a little warm in here. All right, are we still stable? Yes, we are. So moving on to January 11th. Indeed, that day at 6:38 a.m. Eastern Time, the sun perfectly aligns with Pluto, and so everything I was just saying about that will peak at that time, more or less, and that indeed that whole day will be affected by that energy. Other than that, we still have the moon transiting Pisces, so everything's still in this very emotional, psychic, intuitive, sensitive sort of mood. Highly subjective, not really logical, sort of the opposite of logical. And it continues from there. The moon will sextile that Sun-Pluto conjunction earlier in the day, however. Let's see here. Right around soon after 9 a.m. So there may be another sort of strong dose of that energy right around that time, around soon after 9 a.m. Eastern time. But basically it's going to be active the whole day, and that's all you really need to know. Now, moving on, is there anything else that day before we proceed? I'm not noticing anything. Nope, looks like that's about it, basically. All right, so that was January 11th, and then moving to January 12th. We do have the moon entering Aries that day. I see we are blurry, speaking of Neptune and Pisces and all that. We have the moon entering Aries. How does it happen? Just after 3 a.m. and just before that, let us not forget, the moon will align with Chiron in Pisces just after midnight, January 12th. So very late January 11th, early January 12th. The moon lines up with Chiron in Pisces, and so again, that's going to activate, that's going to have us sort of in the mood for the healing of wounds, Chiron. And then soon after that, as I said, soon after 3 a.m., the moon enters Aries, where we will have the energy shifting to that which is much more impulsive and aggressive and assertive and things of this nature. And then later that day, at about soon after 7 p.m. Eastern Time, the moon will line up with Mars in Aries. And so you can really expect the intense aggression and assertion, and yes, the potential for anger and things like that to be activated that evening. Not just around 7 p.m., but that whole day, perhaps, but especially that whole evening. Again, that's 7 p.m. Eastern Time. All right, let's see here. Hey there, welcome back, Ryan. Glad to have you here. So, do we have anything else on January 12th before we proceed? Yes, we do. That Moon-Mars conjunction is trined by Venus, and so that's going to take the edge off of the potentially destructive or explosive energy we may be looking at there. Venus is going to make it much more about what we like to experience. It could also include some, say, romance or stuff relating to relationships, and it's a trine, it's energy that's more harmonious, easier to work with, and so that at least, sort of dilutes the potential over intensity with some more positivity. So let's see here. And then Venus is getting closer and closer to perfectly trining Mars at this time. Like, when this happens, we have the Moon and Mars aligning at 8 degrees of Aries. Meanwhile, Venus is at 546 of Sagittarius. So we have Venus getting closer and closer to perfectly trining Mars, which is going to be, a very harmonious thing. The masculine and feminine energies working together, that's going to be a nice day. And we'll be coming to that here in just a bit. So that's it for January 12th, it looks like. Let's go into January 13th, where we still have the moon in Aries. But now, oh boy, let us see. Now we have earlier that day, Mercury lining up with Saturn in Capricorn. And that happens at 8:30 a.m. that day, January 13th. So Mercury lining up with Saturn, well, if it manifests negatively, that would be like our mind hitting a wall, or our thoughts, or even our communication hitting some kind of a wall, because Saturn is the wall, or just limitation, stuff like that. If it manifests positively, that would be like our thoughts and communication being given great structure, great order and structure, which can be very advantageous in many situations. Now, just before they perfect, if we go back a little bit here, to kind of like roughly 4 a.m. or so that morning, the moon will square that conjunction, and so our emotions might be a little bit unhappy with our mind's newfound structure, or perhaps our mind hitting a wall. There might be some, emotional frustration early on January 13th, where we're like, damn, I wish I could move forward, but Saturn, the wall, is saying, no, you're not moving forward until you get it right. But for those of you who have gotten it right on that day, congratulations, you should get a free pass from Saturn. But don't count on it, because it is a square. So let's see what else we have here. So as I said, the moon is still in Aries, and I mentioned that square, and then the moon is slowly also moving towards a square that day with Pluto. So that's going to have us not wanting to deal with power, not wanting to deal with the unconscious realms, not wanting to deal with even our own biological drives and stuff like that. And you can expect that to perfect around 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, January 13th. So some frustration in that area, but that's what we have basically. try to allow yourself to be okay with those deep, dark Pluto realms that day, the unconscious, biological drives, things like that. Try to surrender to that energy would be my advice. But moving on to January 14th, we have, this could be a very interesting day, we have the moon lining up with Uranus that day around just before 11 a.m. So sudden, shocking, unexpected developments highly likely to happen on January 14th. I can't say what they will be, but I can say that they will likely be that day. For many people, at least for the majority of the world. Earlier on, the moon will square the sun. That's basically going to be conflict between our emotions and our ego. So try to resolve that, that sort of inner conflict. And that's going to be earlier that morning. And then the moon will enter Taurus that day around, let us see, around 1:30 or so. And so the energy will go from maybe being kind of crazy earlier in the day with the moon's alignment with Uranus in Aries to something much more stable with Earth sign Taurus, much more stable and secure, which it's like, thank the gods, because, with the energy we just went over, that's some potentially highly explosive or volatile energy. But then it's like the moon moves into Taurus, and that's our saving grace later in the day. And we get some much needed stability from there. As for anything else that day, let us see. I don't think there's anything. So let us move on to January 15th. I'll drink some tea. It's like listening to a calm, old, warm-sounding radio, listening to you talk about astrology, Mr. Poetic. Well, thank you, Ryan. I'm glad that you enjoy my astrological observations. They're a lot of fun to do. So January 15th, the moon is now well into Taurus, and so we have that stability, and even more good news, the moon trines Saturn in Capricorn that day around 2 p.m., soon after 2 p.m., giving us even more stability. And so we've had maybe kind of a crazy couple of days or so, and now we're getting some much needed stability on January 15th with the moon in Taurus. As if that wasn't enough good news, Venus is getting very close at this time, just a little over a degree away from perfectly trining Mars. And so, we've got the masculine and feminine energies working together around this time. So, more deliciousness. And adding to that, we also have the moon sextiling Neptune around, let us see, just after 4 p.m. that day. So our imagination and everything getting activated in what will most likely be a very positive way. So yeah, things definitely end up looking a lot brighter around this time of the month, around halfway through the month, I guess. At least on January 15th they do. And then a little bit later, we have the moon trining Mercury, giving harmony to our mental world and communication. That'll be around 8:30 or so that evening. And other than that, looks like that's about it for that day. Just making sure. Okay, moving into the 16th. We still have the moon in Taurus, so it's getting towards the end of it. We have the moon trining the sun today. The sun's still in Capricorn. It's towards the end of Capricorn now, 26 degrees. So now we have our emotions harmonizing with our ego or conscious minds. So more good news in that area. Although things are sort of building up again to a potential stressful level where we have the sun getting ready to perfectly oppose the north node. Although I don't know, sometimes I see the north node calculated differently, but just around this time in general, we might feel basically our ego in conflict with our sense of life purpose. So that could be a bit of a challenge around this time, but hopefully it won't be too bad. Anything else for January 16th, though? Let me see. Yes, later that day, the moon will sextile Chiron around 5:30 or so Eastern time. And so that'll make it that much easier for us to engage in the healing of wounds. And that also happens when the moon is still in a trine with the sun itself moving into a perfect sextile with Chiron that will perfect in another day or two. So that's some good stuff right there, basically speaking. Now, moving on. Well, later that evening, story's not over yet for January 16th. Later that evening, just before 8 p.m. Eastern Time, the moon will then move into Gemini. And so the energy will go from stable, determined, consistent Taurus to playful, intellectual, mischievous Gemini, basically. So the energy will get maybe less stable, but also much more like playful and whatnot that evening of January 16th. All right, so we have that. Will I be doing February? Yes, I will be. I plan on it anyway, once we get there. Probably going to be doing these every month from now on. All right, anything else for the 16th? Let me see. Doesn't look like it. Moving into the 17th. Wait a minute, where's Venus and Mars? Okay. Moving into the 17th, the moon is now more further into Gemini. It will oppose Venus that day, specifically more into that afternoon. And so we're going to have, some potential conflicts in the area of relationships or our likes and dislikes, trying to get what we want, trying to enjoy ourselves. Our emotions just might not be having it that day. On the other hand, if we can navigate that energy well, we might find ourselves on the other side of that, because an opposition doesn't automatically mean something bad, in which case we could perhaps even more than usual enjoy ourselves that day. So we'll see what happens. Let's see, what else do we have here? The moon will sextile Mars while it's in this opposition with Venus, and so we'll get a sense of our assertion and aggression and stuff like that working to our advantage that day, that sort of thing. The moon will also quincunx Saturn in Capricorn a little bit later on, around 7 p.m. So there may be some frustration in dealing with limitation that day. There may be something that's preventing us from getting exactly what we want, and unfortunately, we just can't really seem to do anything about it on that day at that time. I've noticed two of my other favorite small YouTubers that still communicate with their audience. I've started live streaming more after you started. I just find that cool. Interesting. Maybe it was something in the collective psyche that said it's time for more YouTubers that communicate with their audience to start live streaming. Interesting. Well, I always intend to communicate with my audience regardless of what happens with my channel. It's kind of what these live streams are all about, or at least a big chunk of what they're all about, a big part of what they're all about. So January 17th, as we're moving along here, Venus is getting closer and closer to trining Mars, to perfectly trining Mars. But we're not there yet. So moving on to the 18th, well, we've got some interesting stuff here. First of all, this is when Venus perfectly trines Mars. Second of all, we have Mercury lining up perfectly with Pluto at virtually the same time. And as that's happening, third of all, we have the moon quincunxing that Mercury-Pluto conjunction. So let me try to explain all this properly. First of all, Venus trine Mars perfects at 11:48 a.m. Eastern Time that day, January 18th. And again, this is the feminine energy, Venus, working cooperatively with the masculine energy, Mars, and masculine working cooperatively with the feminine. So for those in relationships, this could be a very romantic day, for one. This could also be a day when, like, those who maybe frequently have conflicts are working together, where there's cooperation all around in all kinds of relationships, not just like romantic ones, but all kinds of them. You know, there's cooperation, there's harmony, and stuff like this. But at the same time, we have Mercury aligning with Pluto, as I mentioned, which is going to focus our minds into all of this like deep, dark, unconscious stuff that Pluto talks about, and also power dynamics, biological drives, and that includes sex, which might be even more emphasized that day with Venus trining Mars. So we'll have that going on, but meanwhile, the moon will be quincunxing that Mercury-Pluto conjunction. So, how do I put this? Even though we have a lot of harmony going on, that quincunx might have a part of us, especially our emotions, being like, something just doesn't feel right, or we just can't quite get some kind of communication right, or there's something about our emotions that's being left on the back burner. You know, something is just not quite right that day. But I would say don't let that ruin things for you, because by and large, that's going to be quite the good day. And maybe even just those couple of days in general around the 18th, you know, that's a lot of harmony there with Venus trine Mars. So look forward to that. Other than that, we have the sun getting closer and closer to squaring Uranus, and this is kind of a big deal. Because when the sun squares Uranus, we're talking the ego in conflict with sudden, shocking, unexpected developments. And so we're talking the kinds of unexpected developments around this time, not just on the 18th, but around this time, that might not be so pleasing to the ego. It might just be stuff that we almost don't want to deal with or whatever. But it doesn't have to be that. It could also be things that if we use the energy wisely, work very much to our benefit. So what else do we have here? Sometimes I feel like I should stick with almost the more major developments, just because I feel like those are the ones that people remember more easily. Maybe you should take that day easy, the 18th. Perhaps, but it's going to be, you know, kind of 17th, 18th, and 19th kind of deal with the sun square Uranus. Now, as for later in the day, on January 18th, we will have the moon moving into Cancer. And that happens around just before 11 p.m. Eastern Time. So maybe some people will be asleep by then, but I don't know, those like me would likely not be. So the energy is going to go from being all playful and more intellectual and mental, while in the moon's in Gemini, to much more emotional and self-protective, you know, concerned about the emotional realms and one's own safety and stuff like that of Cancer that night and into the next couple of days, of course. So you can expect that kind of shift on late on the 18th. As for the 19th, let us see here. The moon is now fairly well into Cancer at 8 degrees by halfway through the day. And searching to see if there are any like major aspects here. Not quite yet. We've got stuff building, but not that I'm noticing. We have a conjunction between Venus and Jupiter building, but it's not quite there yet. We have a square from Mars to Saturn building, but it's not quite there yet. I thought I saw one other thing. Well, we even have a square from Mercury to Uranus building, but it's not quite there yet. So I'm not sure what more to say about January 19th other than that, this stuff's building up in the background. Meanwhile, the moon's in Cancer. It's going to be more of like a moody, sort of emotional, self-protective kind of day. As for the 20th, moving right along here, this marks a significant shift in the energy because the sun will move into Aquarius that day, from Capricorn into Aquarius. And so that's going to take a little bit of the weight of reality off of things, but not completely, because we still have Mercury, Pluto, and Saturn all in Capricorn. But now with the sun moving into Aquarius, things will take on a much more intellectual, detached vibe for a while, for the next month or so. And let's see, while this is happening, we are getting closer and closer to the full moon, which happens right after midnight, January 21st. So late January 20th, early January 21st will be the full moon in Leo. There's almost going to be in Cancer, but it's going to be in Leo. And so the energy peaks around this time. So basically the 20th and the 21st, you can expect to be fairly intense days, possibly very stressful, because that's what a full moon is in astrology. It's the emotions, the moon, in conflict with the ego or conscious mind, the sun, in opposition. And it's in Leo, so things would be very bold and expressive that day, as the energy peaks in this way. So full moon just after midnight, January 21st, the early hours of January 21st, Eastern time. In addition to that, we have Venus getting now very close to aligning with Jupiter, keep in mind. And so that's going to be something. We're going to be talking about the idea of potential overindulgence there, especially with the square to Neptune, which we'll get to. What else do we have? We have Mercury getting closer and closer to the square with Uranus. And let's just see here. Other than that, just expect, as always, late January 20th, early January 21st, the mood shifting from the emotionality of Cancer to being bold and expressive and playful when it enters Leo. So if we fast forward later into January 21st, we have the moon now fairly well into Leo. We have Venus very close to aligning with Jupiter, but actually we're going to need to back up just a bit here, because what we see on, where the hell is it? On January 13th is the perfecting of the Jupiter-Neptune square. So there's going to be sort of a risk of delusion and overindulgence around January 13th and potentially almost the whole month. But how this relates to what we're talking about right now is Venus is getting closer and closer to squaring Neptune as well, while lining up with Jupiter. And that happens, where the hell even is it? That happens right around the time of the full moon. Actually, just before the full moon, Venus will perfectly square Neptune. So, while being very close to being conjunct with Jupiter perfectly. So again, there's this risk of overindulgence. It could be a very good thing in many cases because it's Venus and Jupiter. A lot of sweet and delicious and enjoyable stuff. But it could also be very, like, too much of a good thing kind of thing. Overindulgence, too much food, too much alcohol, being up too late, these sorts of things. So look out for that January 21st. Well, kind of January 20th and 21st, I guess. Let's see, what else? All right, moving right along into the 22nd. Moon still in bold, expressive, dramatic Leo. But nearing the end of that. The Venus-Jupiter conjunction perfects that day, so that could also, manifest as almost like a love of knowledge, a love of expansion, a love of optimism, a love of idealism, a love of a belief in that we can do it, a love of belief systems. So we could have that going on around the 22nd. Let's see what else. The moon will quincunx Saturn, Pluto, and then eventually Mercury on the 22nd. And so there may be also some frustration in the mix here because a quincunx is basically frustration. So I'll just mention that. I'm trying to sum this stuff up more because I don't want to go over too many needless details. All right, then looks like it's going to be late at night on the 22nd, where we will have the moon entering Virgo around 10:30 p.m. Eastern time. So the energy will become much more practical, earthy, focused on our day-to-day activities, our health, and stuff like that at that time. Maybe we'll find some much-needed stability, even as the moon will have just trined Uranus earlier in the evening, leading to some potential, sudden developments, but probably more of a positive nature because this is a trine, sudden insight, stuff like that. Let's see, what else do we have here? By the 23rd, the moon is now well into Virgo, 8 degrees 30 minutes, and is moving towards an opposition with Neptune. Mercury is nearing the end of its transit through Capricorn, now at 29 of Capricorn. And later in that day, let us just see here, the moon gets closer and closer to perfectly opposing Neptune until at around 10 p.m. it will oppose Neptune. And so the potential for confusion and illusion later in the day on January 23rd is very present. So keep that in mind. Meanwhile, Mercury is getting extremely close to finishing its transit through Capricorn, but still isn't quite there yet. Moving on to the 24th, Mercury does indeed finish its transit through Capricorn, moves into Aquarius that day, and so expect our thoughts and intellect to be much more intellectual. Aquarius might not be one of Mercury's home signs, but it still feels pretty much, I believe, right at home in the sign of Aquarius because it's very similar energy. I'll put it to you this way. Aquarius is the home sign of Uranus, and Uranus is a higher octave of Mercury. So Mercury goes into Aquarius, and it's like, I almost feel right at home. So yeah, that'll be a definite shift in the energy from our thoughts being all Capricorn-like and serious and calculating and focused on limitation and hard work and stuff like that, to now being much more like detached and intellectual and seeing things in a much more logical way and stuff like that. Meanwhile, Mercury is also moving towards a conjunction with the Sun at this time, but it's not quite there yet, so we'll get to that when it is there, but that's building up. The Moon is still in Virgo and doesn't move into Libra until, let us see, until just after midnight, and it opposes Chiron a couple hours prior to that, so like around soon after 9 p.m. So again, I'm not going to go over every little detail because it's just, I don't know, getting ridiculous at some point. But when the Moon enters Libra very late that night, on the 24th and then into the 25th, the energy, of course, is going to be much more intellectual and detached, much more diplomatic, much more like about peace and harmony and things like that. So that's what we have going on at that time. Meanwhile, Mars is getting extremely close to perfectly trining Jupiter, and that sort of aggressive enthusiasm is building and building and building. So we can look forward to that. But moving on into later that day on the 25th, let's just see here. The Moon trines the Sun that day, so even more potential for harmony and stuff like that. Mercury is getting closer and closer to the Sun, and Mars does indeed perfectly trine Jupiter that day. So the 25th, expect the enthusiasm and the belief in ourselves and the idea we can do it and we can succeed, we can go far, we have the wherewithal to do it, and we're ready to go do it right here, right now, to be very strong. January 25th and kind of just around there. You know, that's Mars trine Jupiter. You know, Jupiter's bigger, better, more. Mars is, let's do it right now. Let's be impulsive. Let's go for it. Let's see. You're a good dude. I thank you. I mean, I'm doing my best. Some of this almost seems like I'm saying too much, and so it's a little frustrating, but I'm going over it anyway. Also, it's still too warm in here, so I'll be right back. Okay, stream's still good. All right. Moving on into January 26th, the Moon's still in Libra. It will square Saturn and Pluto that day, however. So some potential conflicts involving dealing with limitation as well as dealing with power and the unconscious realms and stuff like that. Meanwhile, Mercury is getting closer and closer to aligning with the Sun, which is placing more and more of an emphasis on our thoughts and intellect, but we're not quite there yet, but that energy is building at this time. The Moon sextiles both Jupiter and Venus that day, and so there's a lot of harmony there, basically speaking. A lot of expansion and knowledge, as well as just enjoyment of that which is sweet and delicious. So we have that. Let's see, anything else before we proceed? All right, let's just continue then into the 27th. By now, the Moon has entered deep, dark, passionate Scorpio, and so we're going from that, sweet harmony of Libra to deep, dark, moody, passionate, all or nothing, intense Scorpio. That's going to be the general vibe we've got going on for a couple of days. And when this happens, the Moon will square both Mercury and the Sun, now closer and closer to being conjunct that day. So basically expect our emotions to much more easily be in conflict with our mind on January 27th. That will be the challenge to overcome that day. Then moving on into the 28th, the moon is still in Scorpio, so we're still in that sort of vibe. Mercury is very close to the sun now, less than a degree away. So our mental activity is really getting emphasized by this point. And let us also keep in mind that Saturn is getting closer and closer to the aforementioned sextile with Neptune, which has to do with making the dream real. So keep that in mind. Moving on to the 29th, the moon will enter Sagittarius that day in the sort of late morning hours Eastern time. And so the mood will go from all deep and intense and dark in Scorpio to be much more optimistic and uplifting and hopeful in Sagittarius that day. You can expect that transition in the mood. The moon will also form a grand water trine a little bit before that while it's still in Scorpio with Chiron and the North Node. So even more like moodiness going on, grand water trine, water emotion. So we can expect that day, although then it will kind of fade most likely as the moon makes its way more and more into Sagittarius and the day goes on. Let's see. Mercury is now just about to perfectly align with the sun. Let me see when that perfects. The sun just keeps racing ahead of it. There it is, right around 10 p.m., January 29th. Mercury will perfectly align with the sun, and our mental world is going to get a huge amount of focus placed upon it, as well as our communication and all things technological. So that, again, the energy's been building for a bit. Well, now this is when it more or less peaks that night of January 29th. And that will, of course, be with us, for days to come as well. Meanwhile, in the early hours of January 30th, the moon will sextile that Mercury-Sun conjunction, adding even more emphasis to it. And we're talking around like 5 to 6, 5 to 5:45 a.m. or so, the morning of January 30th. So that energy basically sort of carries into the next day. And then later that day, the moon continues its transit through hopeful, optimistic, idealistic Sagittarius, and will line up with Jupiter later that evening, not too long after 7 p.m., so maybe like 7:15 or so. And of course, moon lining up with Jupiter, especially being in a trine with Mars, and the moon-Jupiter conjunction is in Sagittarius, well, we're going to be feeling even more like we can do it, and all kinds of like, let's do it now, and belief in ourselves, and hopeful and optimistic and stuff like that. And it's funny because as this is happening, meanwhile, we've still got Saturn and Pluto and Capricorn, and especially Saturn is there saying, no, 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 not so fast. You better slow down and make sure you get things right before you think that you can go sailing off into the horizon or whatever, or charging off into battle. So it's a funny sort of, dynamic. Part of us is going to be like, oh yeah, let's go, 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 do it now, now, now. Another part of us, the Saturn part, is going to be like, hold the hell on. Just hold your horses, as they say. So that's January 30th. And now we come to the end of our little tale on January 31st. And let me see how I want to describe this. So first of all, the moon aligns with Venus that day, so that's going to feel very good to us, generally speaking. You know, Venus all sweet and delicious and stuff like that. So really great day for, you know, planning any kind of social gatherings or parties or going out to eat or just doing anything you enjoy, basically. Um, and the moon will be in Sagittarius, looks like most of that day. We'll get to the later in the day here in a bit. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Saturn in Capricorn does indeed sextile Neptune in Pisces that day. And so what we're looking at here is, like I mentioned earlier, like with the beginning of the month, we might think, oh, like we can accomplish this great thing, this dream that we have. And then I said, but at the beginning of the month, it's probably going to be more or less a delusion. Well, now by the end of the month, it's not a delusion anymore. We have Saturn, the planet of reality, and the planet of let's make it real, in a supportive sextile to Neptune, the planet of dreams. That's basically saying the dreams are getting the support of make it real Saturn. So by the end of the month, I mean, this is like January's saving grace, you know, that which we dreamed of at the beginning of the month. I love how beautifully poetic this is. We now get to finally make real by the end of the month. You know, that which we imagined and wanted to create at the beginning of the month, but maybe ran into some difficulties doing so, we finally get to make real by the end of the month. Now, again, this is a general interpretation for everyone in the entire world. Like, how your life individually will unfold is still up to you and your free will, you know, how you choose to use this energy. But generally speaking, that's what we can look forward to happening throughout the world. So other than that, I'll just say, let's see, later that day, I think the moon will eventually enter Capricorn. Yes, it does, just before 8 p.m. And so the mood will indeed go from being all optimistic and idealistic in Sagittarius to a much more like serious reality-based type of mood that evening, just before 8 p.m. So that's about it. If I were to give a summary on this, and also feel free to ask any questions if anyone has any questions. If I were to give a summary of this month, I'd say it's really largely about, in addition to what I already said about finally getting to make our dreams real by the end of the month, but having difficulty doing that, maybe being delusional about doing that at the beginning of the month, there's all this like conflict between a part of us that wants to impulsively do things right now and another part of us that wants to make sure that we take it slow and get it right. And so we have this idea of putting on the gas, hitting the gas, and also hitting the brake. But the interesting thing about that analogy is what happens when you effectively utilize the gas and the brake when driving a car or whatever. What happens is you can go really freaking fast. You can get to where you're going, but you have to know when to put on the gas and when to put on the brake. And so that's the challenge, I believe, of this month, January 2019, as well as basically you've got to be patient, make sure that you get things right before you can manifest your dream or whatever. So now, I would say that's it, but I do have a little surprise for you guys that I thought of that should make this even more fun this month. And this won't take long, but since I also happen to be able to read tarot cards, I thought, why not do a quick Celtic Cross tarot forecast about this month of January 2019 right here, live on stream, and see what we get and see how that data compares to the astrological data we've just gone over to hopefully gain an even clearer and deeper perception into just what this month is all about. So I'm going to do that now. Some of you who have been following me might expect me to use the Crowley Thoth deck since I just got that, but I've got to explain something about that. I am electing to use the Rider-Waite because with my being so new to the Crowley Thoth deck, I have no way of knowing if I would be anywhere near as accurate using that deck. So we are going to use the Rider-Waite deck, at least for this, and then, you know, we'll go from there, basically. The normal deck, well, if you want to consider it the normal deck, then yes. All right, so let me go grab my cards, and then we shall proceed. Also, I'm just going to take a very quick breather since that was a lot of talking, just for 30 seconds or so, and then we'll continue. I feel kind of bad that this had to be so late at night, but nevertheless, that's what we have. But apparently this stream has 2 comments, or no, that's live viewers, never mind. I'm looking at the numbers right now. Yes, we only have 2 viewers right now, but that's okay. Normally I get a few more, but this is happening late at night because that's what the universe seemed to dictate in this case. All right, so I know, is it buffering for you? Damn, I hope that improves. All right, so we are going to do a Celtic cross spread for the month of January 2019 now, and look ever deeper into its energy. Getting the cards arranged. I'm sorry to hear that you're having technical difficulties, Ryan. I do hope they improve. I am on that 5 gigahertz network now, which is as fast as it gets, you know, faster than I've ever been on before. So I'm about as secure connection-wise at my end as possible. That freaking blur needs to leave us alone. All right, so we would like a Celtic cross forecast for the month of January 2019 that gives us insight, deep insight into the overall psychological state of the entire human race for the duration of this month of January 2019. Deep psychological insight, not fortune telling or any of that mediocre BS, but real, true, deep psychological insight that is of the utmost value. So let's see what we get. Feels a little weird to use these cards after the Crowley Thoth ones recently. These ones are significantly smaller. Yes, in addition to the astrology, let's see what the tarot cards have to say for January 2019. It improved for you? Good, good. What will be the energy of January 2019? there. We're getting there. We are getting there. And there we go. We're locked and loaded. Maybe not the best expression, I don't know. All right, let's fix that blur and let's see what we've got. Current outside influences, the Page of Swords, the Challenge card, the Emperor reversed. Underlying energy, Six of Wands, the Past, the Fool, hope to achieve, the Three of Cups reversed, the near future, the Moon, attitude or position, Judgment reversed, outside force coming in, Ace of Swords, there's that Sun-Mercury conjunction, hopes or fears, Knight of Pentacles reversed, and the final outcome is the Seven of Swords. All right, well, let's see. 12 points on your dice. Very cool. All right, let me analyze this real quick and see what we have. It's very interesting comparing it to the astrological data, as we can already see with Page of Swords, current outside influences, talking about the mental realm, and then the Moon in the near future, all those Neptune influences clouding our vision, making it more difficult for us to see clearly. Same with Judgment reversed for the attitude or position of the situation. We might think that we're seeing clearly, but we're not. You know, and that's especially going to be like kind of more the meat of the month, like not the beginning, not the end, but sort of around the middle and thereabouts. However, with that Sun-Mercury conjunction that I mentioned, we have the Ace of Swords for the outside force coming in, which is going to cut through that subjective or overly subjective, that difficulty in seeing clearly. It's going to cut through that and bring great clarity with the Sun's entrance into Aquarius as well, intellectual Aquarius, air sign Aquarius. So indeed, we have that. Let's see, the challenge card being the Emperor. That's probably referring to all of that Mars energy, Mars now having returned to Aries. So it's like saying the challenge will be to use that aggression and assertion constructively, you know, be careful about getting too angry or stuff like that. And with the crossing over the Page of Swords is like, be careful about getting too enthusiastic about your mental realm, particularly earlier in the month, because it may be prone to delusions then, again, with the Neptune thing and the Moon card in the near future. The Six of Wands for the underlying energy, that's going to talk about our willingness to deal with the public and being in the spotlight and stuff like that this month. Again, that's probably more, you know, Mars and Aries kind of stuff. With the Fool card in the past, that's probably also actually talking about Mars entering Aries, because Aries being the very first sign and like a new beginning and stuff like that, first sign of the zodiac, and the Fool being all about that energy. And so, and plus it's just being the very beginning of the year, a whole new year. And so, you know, there's that Uranian crack of lightning or strike of lightning and crack of thunder with the Fool and starting a whole new cycle. That's indeed what we've got going on here. Three of Cups reversed for help to achieve. So that's going to be like all that like Jupiter, Venus stuff, I think. So trying to enjoy ourselves and whatnot, enjoy social gatherings and all these things, but it's reversed. It's blocked, you know, trying to overcome the blockages. The blockages are all the other stuff we talked about, you know, the delusions and confusion that Neptune talks about, that Neptune involves, and we see that with the Moon card in the near future as well. Let me think, what else do we have here? With the Knight of Pentacles reversed in hopes or fears, that's talking more about our desire to try to make progress and gain success in the practical world, to try to make our dreams real again. But it's reversed because for the longest time this month, that is blocked. We run into all kinds of obstacles, particularly our own confusion and delusion around the subject. We're concerned, perhaps in the back of our minds, about how long it's taking to find success. But, well, we've got to be patient because Saturn doesn't sextile Neptune until the very last day of the month. Then the Seven of Swords, the outcome card, very interesting. Let me think here. The Seven of Swords is so often going to talk about individuality and moving against the flow and stuff like that. But in this context, very interesting for that being the end of the month. Almost like saying that we're finally going to get away with that which we could not get away with earlier in the month. So when we began the month with the Page of Swords and we're all like hyped up on the inside about all these new ideas and stuff, but then we meet with the confusion and delusion of the Moon card. Well, finally, by the end of the month, Seven of Swords, now we're going to get away with being hyped up and excited about our new ideas. And why is that? Probably because the Sun is going to conjunct Mercury in Aquarius. All that air energy, those new ideas are going to come forth like crazy. Let me just see, as I often do, if I drew one more card, what would it be? The Ace of Cups. So if we drew an 11th card for additional insight, Ace of Cups, lots of emotion. And we saw that in the astrology this month as well, with like the grand water trines and everything, and also the Jupiter and Venus stuff, including Jupiter-Venus conjunction. So a lot of emotion and enjoying of love and that which is sweet and delicious and all that. Of course, on the negative side, though, the Ace of Cups can be too much emotion. It can be having to let out emotion that we've repressed. And so maybe that will factor in as well, particularly with some of those aspects that we saw to Wounded Healer Chiron. So keep that in mind. He protect, he attack, but mostly he poetic. Very true. Very true. That works very well. So, does anyone have any questions on the astrology or the tarot reading we just did about this month compared to the astrology? Part of me still feels strangely unsatisfied, I have to be honest, almost like there's something more that I'm just not quite seeing here. But if I could see it, I would totally say what it is. I'm just not sure. Well, the Judgment card reversed, that could be like... that could be also related to what we were talking about with the Sun conjunct Pluto, when that happens. And the potential for a lot of people to not use that energy effectively. So when that happens, which is on... where is it? January 11th, when the Sun conjuncts Pluto. A lot of people might not want to look into those deep, dark realms. They might not want to take the light of their consciousness into the shadow. They might not want to perform that alchemy. So the message there with Judgment reversed is try to see the big picture and try to take the light of your awareness into the darkness within you, transmuting it into light. So anyway, there's that. I think it makes sense. Good, Connor. Good. All right, so I guess that's basically it for the astrology and the tarot reading for January 2019. Now, I do want to talk about, however, with this, like I said at the beginning of the stream, with this being the first month of the year, it's a whole new year, I want to talk about some of the upcoming astrological aspects that are quite huge. because of their significance, including one that will happen in about a year that is really intense. So, first of all, as I've been talking about recently, for the entirety of this year, well, at least until December anyway, we have Jupiter in its home sign of Sagittarius. This is in contrast with Saturn being in its home sign of Capricorn. And so there's part of us that is indeed being all optimistic and idealistic and believing in ourselves and stuff like that with Jupiter. But then there's also the part of ourselves that's like very much like we have to face reality, and like reality is asserting itself to us and limiting us whether we like it or not. We've got both of those going on right now. And those planets are complements, by the way. Like Jupiter is the complement to Saturn. Jupiter's expansion to Saturn's contraction. They go together. And we have both of them in their home signs for virtually the entirety of this year. So it's like on one hand, we're feeling this year like, oh, we can believe in ourselves, we can do it. On the other hand, it's like we got to face the reality of things. So that's one thing. Another thing, wait, did I notice your comment? Yes, I did. Yes, I did. I said it was very fitting. But I guess I can put these cards back right now. Another thing that we have is Uranus re-entering Taurus in March, where it will be for the next 7 or so years. And Uranus and Taurus, honestly, I'm going to have to do a whole stream on this in March because that is such a huge development. Maybe I should do a whole stream on Jupiter and Sagittarius and Saturn and Capricorn as well. I'm not sure, but Uranus and Taurus, we're going to see a fairly significant shift in the energy, to say the least, around that time. Like, it's going to become much more about breaking down things that we previously thought were so stable and so set in stone that we took them for granted, And it's hard for me to think of all the different kinds of things that applies to you right off the top of my head, but one thing is like our food supply and food in general, dealing with like GMOs and the toxicity of our food, also probably the toxicity of the environment and stuff like that. These issues are going to be emphasized. We're going to see most likely more earthquakes. Uranus and Taurus is very much the energy of earthquakes. We're going to see probably just even more storms in general globally. In fact, I believe it was the very day that Uranus entered Taurus the first time in May of 2018, May 15th, 2018. I believe it was later that very day where there was this major storm producing one or more tornadoes in New York, or someplace in New York, I think. Not New York City, but New York State. And it was all over the news, all over Twitter. The very day that Uranus entered Taurus, we had this huge storm in that area. And I remember looking at that being like, I'm not surprised whatsoever. So yeah, volcanoes, earthquakes, huge ass storms are going to be much more prevalent, much more likely for the 7 years that Uranus spends in Taurus starting in March. So that should be a lot of fun. Like, Uranus and Taurus, to give you an even better idea of it, it's like Uranus is all about that which is sudden and shocking and breaking down, or breaking tension and breaking things down and instability and chaos. While Taurus is almost the opposite. It's about stability. It's about that which is strong and stable and whatnot. So when Uranus enters Taurus, Uranus has to work a hell of a lot harder, but the changes are much more long-lasting. The changes are that much more powerful because of how much harder Uranus has to work in Taurus. So again, we can look forward to that starting in early March, whereas Uranus in Aries that we had for about 7 years was mainly about rebellion, as far as I can tell. So at least it'll take the edge off of the rebellion somewhat, but um, we're going to have a whole new set of challenges to deal with in those years. Also, economic challenges, I should point out. Taurus is all about money and finance. So, yeah, in 2019, um, my advice for money is be very freaking careful with it. Like, this is not a year to overspend or to spend carelessly, nor will the 6 years that follow it be a time to do that. Because Uranus and Taurus may very well spell economic instability throughout the whole world at large. So, yeah, we have that to look forward to. And I would also say because it's Uranus, the planet of the new and unusual and stuff like that, we'll probably see things like, and I don't know a whole lot about this, but things like Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and that whole world be emphasized a lot more in the 7 years that Uranus is transiting Taurus. Now, as far as I guess more political things go, I believe I heard that in the past, when we've had Uranus transit Aries and then enter Taurus in the past, there's often been this pattern of political movements towards the right, because as a response to the intense rebellion that we saw with Uranus and Aries. And so we might see a lot of governments around the world become much more right-wing, much more like conservative, Republican, or whatever the equivalent is in each country. Again, this isn't something that I look into a lot. I am apolitical, but speaking from an astrological perspective, that is quite possibly another development that we will see. Again, as a sort of reaction to the rebellion of Uranus in Aries for 7 years. So let me think, what else might we have here? Well, just keep in mind also that Uranus has an 84-year cycle, I believe it is. So indeed, we have this before. Like you could just trace back that many years in history and just look at the patterns, to see like what might develop. So we'll get into more of that in a future stream. We'll get into more of it. Other than that, let me see here. The next major thing I want to talk about is about as big and intense as it gets and will get for a long time. And that's something that actually doesn't happen this year, but it happens in a year, January of 2020. And that is when we will have the planet Saturn meet up with Pluto in Capricorn. This is something that happens every 33 or so years, and it's always quite big indeed when it happens, because Saturn is extremely powerful, all about order and structure and limitation and the Grim Reaper and all this stuff, fate, destiny. And then Pluto is also extremely powerful, all about the unconscious and once-in-a-lifetime developments, transformation, deconstruction and reconstruction. I mean, these are two of the heaviest hitters of the entire solar system lining up in January of 2020. So here's the thing. You can look back in history to sort of see what happens or what the pattern is when these happen, but I don't want to scare anyone or anything like that, but I've heard, and I don't even get into this stuff because I think doom and gloom is such a messed up way of looking at things, basically. But there are some people out there, and even one person who I do respect, who have talked about fears of a third world war or the possibility of a third world war. And again, I wouldn't be the one to ask if that's going to happen or not, but I will say this. With this Saturn-Pluto conjunction coming up in 1 year, if there's going to be a third world war, I can tell you right now, it would be highly likely to happen in early 2020. If not in January, then within the first couple of months or so of January 2020. So, I hope we're not going down that path, and we always have free will. Our beliefs form reality, so let's keep that in mind. Let's not use the energy that way. But I will say, if there's going to be a third world war anytime soon, or anything of that scale, we're looking at January 2020 or soon thereafter that it will really get going. So I wouldn't be astrologically accurate if I didn't throw that in there. But again, it's like don't look at it as something to be scared of. Look at it as a challenge to meet. Look at it in a positive way. All right. So any questions? World War I or the Great War? Wait, what do you mean? That's cool, I guess. Yeah, it's going to be a very intense time. There's going to be, well, it's hard to say exactly right now, and I'll have to look more into it, but all kinds of powerful developments like that guaranteed to happen in January 2020, basically, and soon thereafter. All right, so if there aren't any further questions on the astrology or anything, I do recall Connor at the beginning of the stream wanted a tarot reading, so I'll be happy to give you one if you still want that. And that'll be the only one that I'm doing for now, basically speaking, unless, I don't know, unless people want to do a tarot reading for donation or something. All right, Connor, and do you still want me to do it with the Thoth deck, though, or do you want me to do it with the Rider-Waite, since I'm likely to be more accurate with the Rider-Waite? Move back to Ireland. I see. I'm also going to check on the status of the stream briefly before we continue. It's taking forever to load for some reason. Okay, here we go. All right, looking good. All right, which deck do you want me to use, Connor? Which deck do you prefer? Here I am multitasking. All right, I didn't lose any subscribers yet during the stream. Yay. Whichever I'm comfortable with. All right. I guess we better use the Rider-Waite then, just to ensure the more likelihood of accuracy. Looks like this person deleted the picture. Damn. Anyway. All right, so your question is if you'll move back to Ireland. All right, then. Let's find out. I'm trying to fix that blur. Yeah, these astrology streams are fun, but they're also almost a bit much. So I might do them differently in the future. Like they're almost a bit like exhausting or something. Like I feel like I'd prefer to find a way to maybe simplify them or something. So I'll think about it. Maybe we could just talk about individual aspects or something like that. All right. Okay. So we would like a Celtic cross forecast for Connor in the chat here on the question of if he will move back to Ireland. Let us see what we get. will Connor move back to Ireland? I think we're good to go. The Chariot, the Knight of Cups reversed, Ten of Pentacles, the Five of Cups reversed, Ten of Cups reversed, the Moon, Death, Seven of Wands reversed, the Nine of Cups. And the final outcome card is the Queen of Cups. All right, let's see here. That's funny, the Chariot, something that talks on a very basic level about movement. Let's see. The question is if you'll move back to Ireland. Well, I mean, unfortunately, based on this reading, it's much more of a yes than a no, because you've got the Chariot, you've got the Moon card, which is going to talk in its own way about movements and changes. You've got the Death card, which is going to talk about changes and all kinds of transitions, stuff like that. The Queen of Cups as the outcome card would be much more about movement than about staying still. But I guess there's a possibility, though, that it could be like almost a more emotional movement that the cards are emphasizing rather than necessarily a physical one. In fact, my God, look at this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of your 10 cards are water cards, talking about emotion. So, I don't know. It's almost like the cards are trying to point out that it's a much more emotional thing than a physical thing, but they are talking about movement. So there's that. And then the only cards that are not water cards would be the Ten of Pentacles for the underlying energy and the Seven of Wands reversed for the outside force coming in. It is, to be honest, emotional, yes. Well, that's basically what it says. I mean, I don't know. Is there anything else that you want to know about it? Any other questions? Any questions on it? Thank you, lad. You're very welcome. Yeah, I hope it goes well for you. That would be sad to have to like leave your friends and whatnot behind and go to a different location. But all right, I feel like I was gonna talk about something else earlier. What the hell was it? It is, but I love both lands. Well, that's good at least. Yeah, you were saying in our last stream how much you loved Ireland, so hopefully it's not too bad of a thing then. Yeah, there's something else I was going to say, not about this, but just about like these live streams or astrology or something. What the hell was it? Yeah, I don't know. Just that maybe in future astrological forecast streams, I don't know. It gets to be a bit much after a while, just going through day by day. Maybe it would be better if I like figured out what the most major aspects were before the stream, which I could do very quickly and easily with my software, and then we could dive into each of those individually during the stream. like look up stuff about them and, focus on them in that way. I think I might do that from now on, perhaps. And then, like I said, whenever there's a major astrological development, like when Uranus re-enters Taurus, I'm pretty damn sure I'll be doing a stream about that, and we'll be spending hours on that, hopefully, because that's pretty huge. All right, so any other questions or comments about anything before we wrap it up here? I'm continually using the Crowley Thoth deck, obviously, every day, getting better and better with it. There's so much more to it, though. Like, it's going to take, I don't know. I think I'm going to need quite a while of practicing with it before I consider myself good enough with it to do proper readings, I guess, to do readings with enough reliability to do them, like, for other people and stuff like that. At least I think so. I don't know. I think I'm already getting better with it, but it's still going to take a bit. There's just so much more to consider with that deck. So much going on. Anyway, all right. Part of me doesn't want to wrap it up just yet, but I guess I'm going to have to because there's not much else going on at this point. So, yeah, January is looking to be a very interesting month. And it's funny how we're kind of going to see this energy recur in various ways throughout the year, from what I recall from another video I was watching about this yesterday. But, we'll get into that as we go. I'm sure I'll continue to do more astrology streams. And meanwhile, remember, if there's a dream that you are trying to actualize, don't be discouraged if you can't get it to happen early in the month, because by the end of the month, the energy is going to be perfect for making dreams real. All right, so that's about it. Thanks so much for watching, to those who are watching now and those who have been watching. Remember, I will be back on Saturday for a tarot stream where we'll be looking at the Wheel of Fortune card, or just Fortune as it's known in the Thoth deck. And then I'll be back on Monday for another Seth stream, and then again on Wednesday for, I don't know yet, for whatever I decide to go with that day. This is also the last stream that I'm ever doing while I'm still officially 28 years old. So I'll be leveling up this Saturday. And we also have the eclipse that night. That should be very interesting. So, yeah, last stream while I'm 28, but also the first stream of 2019. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. And thanks for being here. And I'll see you next time.